In 1914, Europe realised they hadn't gone to war for nearly 100 years, well, outside of the limited wars, so they decided to go kill each other again like they always had. Specifically, the Western Front was brutal and harsh. This was largely due to the fact northern France was heavily fertilised and farmed, which led to the spill out of gases and bacteria that led to such diseases like gas gangrene. Now, there were hopes by the British government and the people that this war would end by Christmas, due to the nature of the Franco-Prussian War and other fast-moving wars. But unfortunately, with the Gatling gun and other defensive technologies like large-shelled artillery, which were called howitzers, this would be an absolute and utter disaster. This would warrant the building of trenches, which would be divided into organised systems, even if sometimes they'd break down. Let's start. For example, the first trench, the frontline trench. This would be directly facing the enemy and no man's land. This line was the most dangerous, heavily fortified, and heavily guarded. Soldiers stood watch here on the fire step. Next, the support trench, positioned roughly 60 to 90 metres behind the front line. It housed second line troops and would immediately rush forward to reinforce the front line during an enemy attack. The reserve trench, situated about 300 to 500 metres behind the support line. This held extra troops, extra ammo and supplies, and if the two first lines breached, counter-offensive could be launched from here. Finally, the communication trenches. These were zigzag trenches to prevent artillery from killing people, and obviously for communication. Next, this is a photo of trench foot. Now, what is trench foot? Trench foot is a condition caused by excessive exposure to water. This would lead to the rotting of the feet and potential amputation. To prevent this, for example, soldiers would dig dugouts or make little posts. These would be where soldiers would sleep, sit, and generally lounge around. While not always effective, with rats and other things crawling around, it's better than sleeping on a damp and bare floor. Next, duckboards. These were incredibly effective. These would keep soldiers dry and allow them to be elevated above the wet and muddy water, though they would sometimes sink due to constant barrages. There are, of course, other numerous conditions, which include trench fever, which was caused by lice that thrived in unwashed hot clothing soldiers living in overcrowded dugouts. This led to high temperatures and fever-like symptoms. Next, shrapnel. Shrapnel was caused by large howitzers that would explode and send little pieces of metal flying everywhere, launching muddy material into soldiers' bodies. And finally, the most deplorable of the weapons, gas attacks. This would include chlorine, phosphine, and mustard gas. It would be not just a physical response, but a psychological one, as this would make soldiers intensely terrified and lead on to a later condition that I will soon say. But medically, the response was limited until around 1916, and were encouraged to urinate on cloths and hold it to their face. Eventually, respirators or gas masks would be used, neutralising gas as a decisive stalemate-breaking weapon in 1916. Next, one of the most silent and deadly killers would be shell shock. The reason this was a killer was because the army did not see shell-shocked men as war-torn soldiers with PTSD. Instead, they saw them as traitors and executed them by firing squad. Now, obviously, Britain wants a healthy and strong army for the war, so they can't be done with this. Firstly, the Brodie helmet was introduced in 1915, being steel and replacing previous caps. This reduced shrapnel fatalities by quite a bit. Next, the Carroll-Dakin method, which was flushing deep wounds with an antiseptic sodium hydrochloride solution to kill gas gangrene. Next, the Thomas splint. This was a leg brace that stabilised fractured femurs, cutting mortality from 80% to 20%. Now, PTSD. This was dealt with many clinics across Scotland and on the front line. Finally, to deal with lice, bathhouses were set up behind lines. Now let's move on to organisation. The RMAC, or Royal Army Medical Corps, was the official medical wing of the British Army. They were responsible for troop health and managing the entire medical network. They expanded from 9,000 in 1914 to over 113,000 in 1918. Next, the Revolutionary Fanny, or the first aid nurse in Yeomanry. They were a group of women who volunteered to join the Western Front and helped graciously. Now let's see how they are practically on the ground. Firstly, stretcher bearers. These were soldiers who went out into no man's land or navigated the trenches to find soldiers who were wounded or needed medical attention. Unfortunately, there were only about 16 stretcher bearers per battalion, meaning it only took up to 4 men to haul a single stretcher. Next, the regiment's lead post, situated roughly 200 metres behind the front line, usually tucked behind a dugout or cellar. Administered immediate first aid and run by a medical battalion officer, the RAP could not handle serious wounds. Its goal was to patch up minor injuries and could return straight to the fight. Next, dressing stations. These are positioned between a quarter mile to a mile behind the front line. They were often housed in protective tents, dugouts, or abandoned buildings. They were staffed by the field ambulance units of the RMAC. This is where triage officially began, and men were systematically split into groups to an urgency. They were provided basic wound care before loading patients with horse-drawn or motorised ambulances. Next, the Casualty Clearing Station, or CCS. These were roughly positioned 10 miles behind the front lines and out of range of standard enemy artillery fire. The most critical hub for operating lives and saving them. This was the first place units equipped with operating theatres, surgeons, and mobile x-rays were. Here, limb-saving surgeries and other amputations were performed. And finally, the base hospitals. These were large civilian or converted military hospitals situated on the French and Belgian coasts, far away from active fighting zones. These massive centres featured advanced laboratories and specialised wards for gas victims or head traumas. If a soldier needed months of rehabilitation or permanent discharge, they were loaded onto hospital ships. And we need to remember, these medical innovations were not just random inventions. They were a direct and desperate reaction to the brutal changes in industrial weaponry and the filthy environment of the Western Front. These men were real soldiers and real fathers, husbands, and even for some female volunteers, wives and daughters.